Hey, and welcome back to Deathly Curious Australia. Or if you're new here, welcome. I'm so glad you found me. I'm your host, Monique, and honestly, it still feels a little surreal finally sitting here recording this podcast. It's something I've wanted to create for a while alongside the paranormal work I do with my husband on YouTube. What started as a passion project somehow turned into something we wholeheartedly love doing, and this podcast feels like the next step for me, a space where I can go deeper, talk more openly, and unpack the conversations we don't always get time to fully explore on camera. So whether you've come across from there or you've just stumbled upon this podcast, thank you for being here. I can't believe I'm already up to episode 4. We actually spent the weekend down at Geelong Jail filming for the channel, and I'm definitely still feeling the paranormal hangover. You know, that exhausted, rundown feeling like you've been on a full weekend bender, except without any of the fun parts. So that's pretty much where we're at right now. But honestly, it also feels really good to be sitting down recording. Now, before we get into today's episode, I just want to say this. What we're about to talk about might challenge some of your current beliefs, and that's completely okay. You don't have to agree with everything. In fact, I'd like you to process it in your own way and find your own answers. It might open something up for you. So just stay with me, hear it out, and be open to the possibility that there may be more than one way to interpret experiences that we have. So, shall we begin? What if everything we think we know about shadow figures, about demons, about possession is only part of the story? Because for centuries, we've tried to define the unknown. We've given it names, built belief systems around it, turned it into something we can understand and something we can fear. But what if those definitions don't fully explain what people are actually experiencing? What if the truth sits somewhere in between, in a space where psychology, energy, belief, and something we can't quite explain all intersect? This is where shadows blur. So, before we go deeper, we need to make something very clear. Shadow figures and demons are not universally considered the same thing. In fact, many investigators, mediums, and researchers strongly separate the two. Shadow figures are often described as human-like, unstable in form, fleeting, reactive, whereas demons in traditional belief systems are described as intentional, aware, manipulative, and consistent in presence. So straight from the beginning, we're not dealing with one category. We're dealing with multiple possibilities that sometimes get grouped together under fear. Let's sit with shadow figures for a moment, because one of the most commonly reported paranormal experiences worldwide, people see them in homes, hallways, historical locations, even out on the streets, always just on the edge of perception, and almost always they don't feel solid. They feel like something trying to exist, but not quite managing it. Some theories suggest that residual energy is replaying, spirits are unable to fully manifest, and they have a fragmented consciousness. And if that's the case, then what we're seeing may not be a fully formed presence, but something incomplete, which could explain why they shift, why they distort, and why they appear darker than their surroundings. Not necessarily because they're evil, but because they lack clarity. Now contrast that with the concept of demons, because the modern idea of demons is actually the result of centuries of evolution. Early interpretations didn't always describe them as purely evil beings. In some cultures, they were messengers, intermediaries, spirits with dual nature. It wasn't until later religious frameworks that demons became defined as entirely malevolent. So when we label something a demon today, we're often applying a modern interpretation to something we don't fully understand. But there's another possibility that sits somewhere between these ideas, because not everything dark needs to be something non-human. What if, in some cases, what people are encountering is a human spirit carrying an extreme level of anger, trauma, or unresolved emotion, a presence that hasn't softened, processed, or moved on. So over time, that energy could become distorted, more volatile, more confronting. And when people encounter something like that, it may feel so overwhelming to them that the only label that seems to fit is demonic. Not because it truly is, but because of how it presents. Think about historical cases of possession, especially involving children. Sudden behavioral changes, speaking differently, acting out of character. In earlier times, these experiences were often immediately labeled as demonic. But today, many of those same behaviors are understood through different lenses. Psychological distress, trauma responses, neurological conditions. So the question becomes, how many cases were misinterpreted? And how many may have involved a combination of internal struggle and something else entirely? So let's talk about the possession spectrum. This is where we challenge the idea of possession itself. Instead of seeing it as something absolute, what if it exists on a spectrum? From awareness to influence to overshadowing to complete loss of control. Because we already accept that connection with spirit can happen. Mediums do it intentionally. So the real question becomes, when does connection become something more? When a medium channels, are they being possessed? Or are they allowing controlled influence? Many describe it as stepping aside, allowing energy through, remaining aware while connected. That's not possession in the traditional sense. It's cooperation. But if that control weakens, if the boundaries begin to blur, then that same process could become overwhelming. And suddenly, it no longer looks like connection. It looks like possession. Now, layer in vulnerability, children, trauma, mental health struggles. When someone is already overwhelmed, their ability to stay grounded decreases. Their sense of self can shift, and in that state, there's another possibility we don't often talk about. What if, instead of being taken over, some people are actually connecting without realizing it? Not intentionally, not with control, not with understanding, but psychically. In a way that's far more open than they know how to manage. Because we already accept that some people can connect with the spirit. Mediums do it consciously. But what happens when that same sensitivity exists without awareness, without boundaries? What we may be seeing is not someone being overtaken, but someone overwhelmed by that connection, where thoughts don't feel like their own, where emotions intensify, where behavior shifts because they don't understand. They don't understand what's happening to them. And historically, that's often labelled as possession. Now, let's talk about something people actively do. Conjuring. Trying to contact something, whether through spirit boards, verbal invitation, repeated attempts to connect. At its core, it's intention. It's opening a door. And once that door is opened, there's no filter on what responds. And here's the reality people don't like to hear. When you invite something in, you don't get to choose what answers. It could be a human spirit, fragmented energy, something opportunistic, or something that simply mirrors whatever gets the strongest reaction. This is where the trickster theory comes in. Some energies don't just exist. They perform. They imitate. They exaggerate and manipulate perception. So something may appear far darker and far more powerful, far more demonic than it actually is. Because that presentation creates fear, and fear is energy. Then there's another layer that's often treated as undeniable: vexation. physical effects, scratches, marks, bruising. And this is usually where people draw a firm line because it feels real in a completely different way. It's not just something seen or felt. It's something that leaves a mark. But even here, things aren't always as straightforward as they seem. Because in certain locations, particularly places tied to violence, trauma, or emotional intensity, there are repeated reports of multiple people across different times experiencing similar marks. So the question becomes, is this something targeted or something reactive? I've personally witnessed something like this. A friend of mine, completely grounded, not expecting anything, was scratched in a location known for heavy, unsettling energy. There was no build-up, no fear leading into it. It just happened. And what's always stayed with me is this. At one point, I actually said out loud if anything was there to scratch me. And instead, it happened to my friend. And even since then, returning to similar places, it's never happened again. Which suggests that this may not be something calculated or intentional, but reactive. A moment of intensity rather than a deliberate act. Now, let's zoom out even further. Think about places like asylums, prisons, sites of trauma. Over time, these locations don't just hold history, they hold emotional imprint, layer upon layer of fear, grief, confusion, distress. And then we add ourselves into that space. People walking in already afraid, or they're expecting something, they're reacting to every sound. Every emotional response adds to that environment. So what happens if something tries to manifest there? What does it draw from? If fear is the strongest energy present, then that may shape how it appears. Dark, distorted, unsettling. Not necessarily because it's inherently evil, but because that's the energy available to express itself through. Now, take this a little bit further, because what if these experiences aren't entirely external? We all carry internal weight. Trauma, fear, anger, grief. Our own inner demons. Now, imagine that interacting with something outside of us. Instead of remaining separate, they amplify each other. They create something that feels darker, heavier, more personal than either would alone. So what's experienced may not be purely spiritual or purely psychological, but something woven between the two. And maybe that's why some encounters feel so deeply personal, why they seem targeted, why they linger, because part of the experience may already exist within us, amplified through fear, vulnerability, belief, or emotional state. And when someone is already struggling, that boundary between internal and external can become incredibly thin. Not necessarily possession in the dramatic way we imagine it, but overwhelm, influence, connection without understanding. So when we step back and look at everything, shadow figures, demons, possession, mediumship, vulnerability, conjuring, trickster energy, environmental influence, and our internal state, we don't just get one answer. We get layers, overlap, a spectrum where belief, psychology, energy, and experience all interact. So, the next time you hear a story about something in the shadows, about something taking control, about something that feels undeniably dark, ask yourself this: is it external? Something internal? Or something in between? If you've ever had an experience you still question to this day, I hope this episode has offered a little clarity, comfort, or maybe even just reassurance that you're not alone in trying to make sense of it. It's healthy to question. And if you feel comfortable sharing your own experience, I'd really love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're enjoying my podcast, please make sure you follow, leave a review, or share it with someone who'd be into this kind of conversation. So if you want to see us out investigating, you can find Date Night with the Ghost Gang over on YouTube. You can also find Deathly Curious Australia on YouTube, on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. And stay tuned, because next episode, Anthony, my husband, will be joining me as my very first guest on the podcast. We're going to sit down and talk about the investigations that have genuinely stayed with him, the places, the experiences, and the moments he still thinks about long after we've left them behind. I'm really excited for this one, because you'll finally get to hear Anthony's side of some of the experiences we've only briefly touched on before. So, I'll see you then. Because in that space where shadows blur, the truth isn't always what it seems. And sometimes it's not just what's in the dark, but what meets it there. Until next time, stay curious, but not too curious. Bye.